hard copy form and also on our website at wilmette.com. Also, our village board meetings are televised on Local Aspects Channel 6 and on the internet. If you look up, you can actually see the cameras in the corners of the room. The red light indicates the active camera. By televising our meetings, we make it easy for our neighbors in the community to follow the proceedings of the village board, see the types of matters that come before us, the questions we ask, and the policies we create. You can find archived videos of village board and other local government meetings at wilmette.com. And I'd like to personally thank all the residents of Wilmette who regularly tune in to Channel 6 and pay attention to the workings of their local government. Now, before each meeting, the board receives a packet of agenda materials. These materials are also posted at wilmette.com on the Friday before the meeting so that residents and other interested parties can review the very same information that board members receive. This week's packet contains 624 pages. Now, we've had an opportunity to review the information in the agenda packet, so if you do plan to address us tonight, we ask you to tell us the most relevant, the most material, the most important points that you'd like us to focus on. And finally, we are community neighbors, and as such, we want our meetings to be as civil and courteous as possible. So, as a courtesy to those around you, please take this time to turn off your cell phones and other devices. And while we're turning off our phones, would the clerk please call the roll?
Trustee Wolf.
Here.
Trustee Sullivan.
Here.
Trustee Plunkett.
Here.
Trustee Dodd.
Here.
Trustee Kurzman.
Here.
Trustee Pierce.
Here.
President Belinsky.
Here. We're all here, so we obviously have a quorum. Next item on the agenda is item 2, public comment. During public comment, we ask if there's any member of the audience who would like to address the board on a matter which is not on the agenda. Members of the audience may address the board on matters which are on tonight's agenda when the particular matter is called. So is there any member of the audience who would like to address the board on an item which is not on the agenda? May I see a show of hands? Okay. Wait. Mr. Axelrod? Is that? Oh, okay. All right. So we'll move on to item 3, which is the consent agenda. As described on the printed agenda, items which are routine business that are not normally debated by the village board are placed on the consent agenda. All items on the agenda that begin with the number 3 are on the consent agenda, and tonight, it's a long agenda tonight, the consent agenda consists of, starting on page 1 with item 3.1, all of the items on page 2, all of the items on page 3, all of the items on page 4, and then the first item on page 5. So items on the consent agenda are up for approval tonight. If an item is not removed by a member of the audience and is not removed by one of the trustees, the item will be approved and it will not be discussed. So I'll begin by asking if there's any member of the audience who would like to remove an item from the consent agenda. May I see a show of hands? Okay. Are there any items that any of the trustees would like to remove from the consent agenda? Okay, hearing none, may I have a motion to adopt the consent agenda?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All right, it's been moved and seconded. Would clerk please call the roll on the motion to adopt the consent agenda?
Trustee Wolf.
Aye.
Trustee Sullivan.
Aye.
Trustee Plunkett.
Aye.
Trustee Dodd.
Aye.
Trustee Kurzman.
Aye.
Trustee Pierce.
Aye.
President Belinsky.
Aye. So motion carries. The consent agenda has been adopted. If you are here for an item on the consent agenda, it was just approved. And I'll clarify for people who are here tonight, again, all of the items beginning with a 3 have been approved, and that includes land use item 3.5, 3.6, 3.7, 3.8, 3.9, 3.10, 3.11, 3.12, and 3.13. So all of those were just approved. If you're here for one of those items, there'll be no further discussion of those items or any of the other items on the consent agenda, so you're free to leave. Of course, you're more than welcome to stay for the rest of the meeting. Now, it's early. The restaurants are still open, so please stop by one of our restaurants before you head home. Next item on the agenda is report of officers, and we'll begin with item 4.1, which is introduction of Randall Tyner, who's recommended for appointment to the Transportation Commission. Sir, would you please approach? Would you take a minute to introduce yourself to the board members?
Good evening. My name is Randall Tyner, as Mr. President Belinsky said. I live at 440 Brookside Drive. Been a Wilmette resident for almost 12 years now. A little bit about myself. I'm a retired Marine Corps gunnery sergeant. After spending 20 years in the Marine Corps, traveling the world and having a lot of fun, I went back to school. I got a bachelor's degree in political science, a law degree, both from Loyola University. I was a prosecutor with the Cook County State Attorney's Office for a little bit. I retired from there in 2017, so it's been almost 2 years now. And currently, I'm doing a little bit of fraud investigation for Geico Insurance and a lot of volunteering in the Cook County Veterans Treatment Courts, putting together a mentor program for the veterans that are involved. So clearly I have a penchant for serving. Look forward to serving on the committee.
And we appreciate your willingness to serve. When we met quite a few months ago now, you said you were interested in serving and had a couple of ideas, but the Transportation Commission opportunity opened up and you were willing to step in, so we appreciate that. Any questions from any of the trustees? Thank you so much for coming. And the next meeting, you'll be actually appointed.
Wisconsin
Yes.
Dells, so.
Well, for the next meeting, and you don't have to be here, so.
No, I won't be here. I'm taking my niece and nephew and a couple of their friends to Wisconsin Dells for a couple of days. So.
I love the Dells, actually. Thank you, sir. Next item is item 4.2, proclamation designated April 2019 as National Fair Housing Month.
How about that?
And it looks like, I'm going to read this off the iPad. So this is a proclamation, whereas the Village of Wilmette finds that decent, safe, and affordable housing is part of the American dream and a goal of all Illinois residents. And whereas April 11, 2019 marks the 51st anniversary of the passage of the U.S. Fair Housing Law, Title 8 of the Civil Rights Act of 1968 as amended, which enunciates a national policy of fair housing without regard to race, color, religion, sex, familial status, handicap, and national origin, and encourages fair housing opportunities for all citizens. And whereas individuals have the right to choose where to live without discrimination based on race, color, religion, age, gender, familial status, marital status, national origin, sexual orientation, gender identity, and/or disability. And whereas acts of housing discrimination and barriers to equal housing opportunity are repugnant to a common sense of decency and fairness, and whereas federal and state laws affirm the right of every person to equal housing opportunity, and whereas fair housing is a positive community good, and whereas economic stability, community health, and human relations in all communities are improved by diversity, and whereas stable, integrated, and balanced residential patterns are threatened by discriminatory acts and unlawful housing practices that result in segregation of residents and opportunities in our region, and whereas the talents of grassroots and nonprofit organizations, housing service providers, financial institutions, elected officials, state agencies, and others must be combined to promote and preserve fair housing and equal opportunity. Now, therefore, I, Robert T. Belinsky, President of the Village of Wilmette, do hereby proclaim the month of April 2019 as National Fair Housing Month in the Village of Wilmette, and proclaim Wilmette as an open and inclusive community committed to equal housing opportunities for existing and prospective residents. We will move on now to the report from our village manager, Mr. Frenzer.
Thank you, Mr. President. In my capacity as village clerk, I'll first announce the unofficial results of the Tuesday, April 2nd, 2019 election. For the office of village trustee, four-year term, the preliminary vote totals are as follows. Joel Feinstein, 1,522. Daniel Sullivan, 2,121. Senta Plunkett, 2,430. Ryrie Peloton, 1,684. And Gina Kennedy, 1,814. Thereby indicating that candidates Sullivan, Plunkett, and Kennedy have been elected. In the contest for village trustee for two-year term, the vote totals were Peter H. Barrow, 2,153, Jeff Axelrod, 1,359, indicating that Mr. Barrow was elected. The official results, known as a canvass by the Cook County Clerk, is promulgated in the last week of April. At that point, we'll have that on the agenda. The new or re-elected members of the board will be sworn in on May 14th, 2019, during the board's regular Tuesday night meeting. We congratulate the candidates who won and thank all the candidates who participated for their civic interest, and it was a pleasure. On behalf of the staff, it was a pleasure to meet all of you. I have two pieces of good news concerning the village's environmental efforts. First, it concerns the village's Rain Ready Wilmette program. Launched on February 21st, Rain Ready Wilmette provides residents the opportunity to apply for a free assessment of their yard, customized landscape design, and a grant of up to 50% of the cost of sustainable landscaping. There are 25 grants available with a maximum grant amount of $1,300. The application deadline was March 30th. We are administering the program through a cooperative effort with the Center for Neighborhood Technology. As I said, the village funded 25 grants. I'm pleased to report to you that the village, through CNT, received a total of 187 applications for the program. All the applicants have received emails confirming the receipt of their application and informing them that a large number of applications were submitted and that if they are not selected, they will be added to a waiting list for future years. CNT will review all the applications and seek additional information by contacting the applicants as needed in order to create a short list, hopefully this week or next week. Then they'll be contacting the applicants to make sure they understand the program and sign the agreement. After home assessments, selected applicants will complete the required permit submittals by July. We expect work to be completed by September 30th and the grant reimbursements submitted by the end of October. So, as I indicated, the program is very successful, has been very much embraced by residents, and we expect to be back discussing it with you in the fall when it comes time to fund next year's. Finally, on April 1st, the village's yard waste program was expanded to include food scrap composting. Residents are able to put acceptable food scraps such as vegetable waste, eggshells, and coffee grounds into their yard waste carts. The program will continue to run annually, April through November, during the yard waste collection season, and we remind residents that the yard waste is no longer collected on Wednesdays. It's collected on the same day as your regular household waste and recycling. The mix of food scraps and traditional yard waste, grass clippings, leaves, twigs, is taken to Midwest Organics. It's ground up, sent out along roads in an open field until it turns into compost. It creates a nutrient-rich soil amendment that improves soil health and function and reduces greenhouse gas emissions. To participate in the food scrap composting program, residents must have an organics yard waste toter, which will be provided for free by Advanced Disposal. Residents can choose between a 35-gallon toter, which is recommended for households that will be composting primarily food scraps, and the standard 96-gallon toter, which is recommended for residents who also compost grass clippings. Yard waste stickers must be affixed to the toter. For each collection, the 35-gallon toter requires only one sticker. The 96-gallon toter, as consistent with past practice, requires 3. Since the village began advertising this new program in February, Advanced Disposal received over 400 new requests for organics toters. Over 200 new customers were added to the program in the last 10 days of March alone, indicating again, the success of the effort by the village and that it's being embraced by residents. We've received considerable positive feedback from residents who are excited that we have taken this step toward creating a more sustainable community. That's all.
Thank you, Mr. Frenzer. Our Corporation Counsel, Mr. Stein, is absent tonight, so he will not be giving a report. Next item on the agenda is item 5, which is the report of the Liquor Control Commissioner. There's no report tonight there, so we'll move on to our standing committee reports. First up, as always, is the Land Use Committee and Trustee Pierce.
All items were covered on the consent agenda.
Next up, item 6.2 is the Finance Committee, Trustee Sullivan.
We have one item this evening. It's item 6.21, which is a report from the Finance Committee regarding a transition to an open 15-year rolling amortization schedule for the public safety pension funds. And I'm about to introduce Ms. Malloy, who has actually led us for the last 2 years in coming up with this recommendation in the plan. And so I'm going to turn it over to Melinda.
Ms. Malloy is our Finance Director, for those of you who don't know her.
Good evening to everyone. I'd like to start out by thanking the Finance Committee. As Trustee Sullivan has just indicated, the committee has spent over 2 years analyzing this issue. I thank them for their time, their patience, and their diligence, because actuary language and math can be extremely exciting. So it was one that they embraced nonetheless. So what we spent our time doing was trying to understand what most municipalities are facing right now, which is a steep escalation in contributions that they're going to be required to make to their public safety pension funds. The goals that we set out for ourselves was to mitigate the ramp up in the contributions, to do so in such a way that we would not crowd out other needs for the village, and to be mindful of our AAA bond rating that we have with Moody's. So the recommendation that the committee is putting forth is a transition to an open 15-year rolling amortization period. And we're really talking about amortizing the unfunded liabilities that have built up in the pension funds over the past 20 years. This is a long-term strategy that is addressing the unfunded pension liability. It's a method that will provide a more predictable framework as we view our pension needs in the future, and it will require increased contributions in the short term, but over the long term, it is actually going to require less of the village's resources. So stepping back from a moment, these next two slides are really going to focus on what I'm going to call the education part of the process that the Finance Committee went through. And what we started out with was trying to understand what are the variables that the village actually has control over. So in a very broad brushstroke, I'm going to tell you that when it comes to pension benefits, those are really set in state statute. The village itself does not have control over the benefits. In terms of the pension assets, there are really three components to it. You have the employee contributions. Those are set by state statute, and you're going to see that there's a difference between police and fire. That's a % of payroll. Investment returns, the types of investments are actually established by the state. It's managed by the pension funds, and it really varies based on market returns. So ultimately, the village has control over its contributions, but there is a minimum state requirement that we have to meet, but we are allowed to make more than that contribution, and that's really what we're going to focus on today. So the actuarial valuation, which is done on an annual basis, has multiple components to it. So when we look at the input side of this, the membership data, the benefit provisions, the asset data and such, those are all provided to the actuary. The actuary provides the calculations and ultimately comes out with one of the main items for us, which is our funded status. They also calculate our unfunded actuarial accrued liability. And ultimately, they come up with what is the employer contribution. And that contribution is calculated by looking at the determined contribution, backing off the employee contribution and investment returns.
Linda, I'm going to interrupt you. The scouts are definitely not required to sit through a pension presentation. So if you want to exit, if you want to gracefully exit, please feel free to do so. We probably only have another, 15, 20 minutes of the meeting, but you may not want to hang around for the whole thing. So, okay. Well, you can watch it on YouTube tonight. Any other students who want to take this opportunity to duck out, you can do that as well. Okay. Sorry, if you didn't get your picture before the meeting, you have to wait till the end of the meeting. So.
Say we worked 2 years on this.
I was going to say, so you can understand why I was thanking the Finance Committee for 2 years.
Right.
So going to then our next slide.
Sorry for the interruption.
Oh, no, that is fair game. This next slide is trying to help us think about what is the growth in the village contribution, and that's truly what the pension challenge is. So in this table that's before you, we have 3 years. Why we started with 1998 is because if you look at the numbers that we have here, especially the total pension liabilities, at that point in time, the village, as most municipalities, we were actually overfunded. We were overfunded to the tune of $2.7 million. Our police fund was 105% funded, and the fire was 106% funded. Now we look at 2019. We are $56 million underfunded combined between both funds. Police is now 64% funded, and fire is about 60% funded. So what happened during that time frame? The state changed and enhanced police and fire benefits. We also had economic downturns, so think of the dot-com budget bubble that happened, that burst at the start of 2000 and early 2000s. We had the Great Recession. And the other piece to this is that the mechanism that the state has put in place for municipalities to fund their pension systems is not designed to address the unfunded status that is been building in the funds. In fact, if anything, it's structured in such a way that in the early years, your required contribution is low, and they often talk about it in terms of it being a hockey stick. In the out years is when you have an escalation. And that's what we're trying to address. We also put on here the projection for 2024. So if we look another 5 years out, if we continue along the path that we are right now, our unfunded liabilities are going to grow from roughly the 56 million that we're at right now to 65 million, and both of the funded statuses are going to decline in the two funds. And that's with us meeting what we call is our required contribution. But that required contribution is based on a formula that, again, backloads the unfunded liability. So, talking about some of the particulars of this current funding policy, state statute says that by 2040, all pension systems are supposed to be 90% funded. The village policy is 100%, and I think you're going to recall that we've talked about that several times over the past several years. This type of a system is called a closed funding system, and the reason is because it has an end date. Now, that end date has changed over time. So you might recall back in around 2011, the actual closed date was 2033. And as we were getting closer to that date and payments started to escalate, the state was feeling the pressure, as were all municipalities, and they decided to push that date back. They have pushed that date back in terms of the 2040 for the city of Chicago already, and there's legislation in place to push that date back for the Article 3 and Article 4 systems. Pushing it back, although it will reduce our required contribution, it does not tackle the unfunded liability, and that number will continue to grow. So as we get closer to 2050 again, we're going to be in the same position, but not the same one. It's going to be worse because the unfunded liability will have grown even larger.
And the rating agencies, you know, we in the past, the rating agencies have knocked us for our reserve levels and for our pension debt. The reserves have recovered quite nicely.
Yes.
But the pension debt, I mean, if this was one of the things that they wanted to hear from us, that we were going to make this change, because otherwise that number just keeps growing and growing and growing, right?
Correct.
And then our required contribution gets to the point where it's almost crazy relative to the budget at that point. Correct.
So that is the concern that they've raised over the last several years. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in some subsequent slides here. So this slide in front of you is just a visual about what I was talking about, and it's showing you the start of that ramp up. So you can see it starts at 2018. So the orange line is showing what the required contribution is going to look like over the next several years going to 2030. So you're going to see that we're at 2018, we were slightly below combined a $5 million contribution to the two funds. By 2030, we're close to $7 million. By 2040, that number goes up over $9 million in terms of a contribution to both the funds. So with this in mind, the Finance Committee then started to look at a variety of ways to try to mitigate this. So we started with what happens if we make no changes and we hope that the state does something. Well, I've already talked about that. It doesn't address the unfunded liability at all, and we're going to have an even greater challenge to try to overcome in the future. The next was to talk about rate of return. Why that is an item that gets a lot of airtime in the news, and there's a lot of discussion around that. As a side note, if you'll recall, the village actually had a 7.5% assumed rate of return. That was up until about 2008, and then we went through a 5-year phase down where we went to the current 7.25. IMRF has just moved theirs, and I bring them up because they're the best funded pension system. They are going from 7.5 in Illinois down to 7.25. And I'll say nationally they are, because if you look at their system, they're over 90% funded right now. So these next several bullet points were a variety of different ideas, and they're centered around moving away from a closed system, so we don't have a set end date of when we have to have our unfunded liability taken care of, because that's where the escalation is occurring, and it's actually looking at a rolling or an open amortization system. After much discussion and analyzing, the Finance Committee determined that a 15-year rolling amortization was the preferred method to go with, and then they tasked staff with looking at a way to implement this in such a way that we could mitigate the impact to the taxpayer. So before we talk about that, just to give you a better sense again about what the open amortization system looks like compared to the closed, if you look at this top graph here, the red line is showing you what the required contributions are going to be just for the fire pension fund. And so you're going to see how it goes up.
That's half of
Yep.
what you were showing before.
That is correct, because that's just the one fund. So again, it's a closed system. So once you hit 2040, what it means is that you should have taken care of all of your unfunded liability, and then it drops down, and then really what you're taking care of is the normal cost going forward.
So another way to think about that red line is the changes that Springfield made to the pension system as it applies to retirees, because the normal cost, the low point in the red line, that's our current employees, what we have to
Yes,
contribute to keep
you are
them
correct.
to stay current. So that spiking of the red line, that's really what Springfield did, because we were 100% funded way back when.
Correct.
The changes that they made have caused that
Much of an escalation,
that much of an escalation in contribution.
and added that much to our liabilities. You are correct.
Right, okay.
So what the blue line does for us is that's now what the impact is for a 15-year open amortization period. And what you see is that over time, that number is going to come down. And the reason why it's coming down is because we're actually tackling the unfunded liability number that's out there. And even though our goal will be to be 100% funded, because it's 15 years, which means you never get to that end date, you never will get to 100%. But where we should end up is somewhere between 80 and 90% funded, which is considered a healthy funded pension system. This slide to me is another way to think about what is the impact of changing from the current system right now, which is the closed system, and going to the open amortization period that we talked about. So if you look at that top table, if you focus on the bolded number, the 38 million, what it means is between now and 2040, 38 million less in resources will need to go to the pension systems for us to meet the funding objectives that are in place.
And that's a gross number, not a net present value.
You are
number.
correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
By funding earlier, you fund less overall, but those earlier dollars are worth more than your later dollars.
Correct.
Not to get too much into the finance, but.
The bottom table is just to give you an illustration that if the state really does go forward and they move the closed system date back to 2050, which, as I told you before, is not addressing the unfunded liability. In fact, it is actually going to increase that number because every year you don't take care of it, it's growing by your assumed rate of return. The difference there is 78 million in terms of resources that we will not have to allocate to the pension funds. And the reason why I'm going to phrase it that way is that the state has also passed legislation that if a taxing entity does not make its required contributions to the pension funds, the state has the ability to withhold any of the funds that it has for that entity, whether it be through tax collections or grants. It will hold those monies, direct them to the pension funds first, and then release the remaining balances. So the required contributions will need to be made.
And there's a community in Cook County that basically just went through that
You are correct.
fight. What would you remember?
Harvey.
Harvey, okay.
Yes.
So Harvey went to court, or the state went to court.
Yes.
And they basically, money, MFT, whatever money, local
Any of the
government
collections.
distributed fund.
Yep.
Sorry, not to your budget, but going to the pension fund.
Correct.
That would be bad.
Yes. So as we have talked about before, this slide is to get a little bit more in depth on Moody's and their credit analysis of the village. So if you recall, we went through what they called a rating analysis in October. It was a surveillance. It wasn't just conducted on the village of Wilmette, but it looked at all of the triple-rated agencies or entities that were out there, and they wanted to look again at their pension burden. And in doing that analysis, Moody's again gave us points for being a very affluent community. The fact that we have home rule status is a positive, and as President Belinsky was talking about earlier, we have a healthy operating reserve relative to our budget. That was not always the case. If you go back to 2008, 2009, that was actually a concern for Moody's.
Even 2010, 11, and 12.
Yes, they still had an issue with that. So we have been able to build up those reserves over time, and now it's actually a credit strength for us. What are our challenges? Number one, the current high pension burden that we currently have, and there is some concern that we have increased exposure to sensitive sales and income tax. Factors that are going to potentially lead to a downgrade, the first thing they had to say is any sort of growth in our pension or in our debt burden, and our failure to strengthen our pension contributions. That last item is their way to let us know that in the discussions that they had with us in the fall, we let them know about the work that the Finance Committee was doing. We let them know that we were considering doing a 15-year rolling amortization funding policy. We made no sort of stipulation that the board was going to embrace this, but we said this is where we're looking towards right now, and this is where we're spending our time. So they made note of that actually in their write-up, and if we are to do this, this is a way that they see that we are actually going to start tackling the liability that's out there. And they realize that whether it's a $38 million issue that we have out there in the future or $78 million, those are revenue sources that we can use to manage other issues that we have in the future. So that's why, again, if we decide not to go down this path, this is something that the rating agency is going to have an issue with. I'll also say as a point of reference to understand the impact if the village is downgraded. Number one of the things to think about is that we are one of only 13 entities in the state of Illinois that Moody's rates that actually has a AAA rating. So number one, we're a standout that way. If we go to the market and we actually received a downgrade, what could it potentially mean to us? Our financial advisor, looking at the market yesterday, gave me a little bit of a framework to look at. So if we were downgraded one notch and we were to go out and do a $60 million issuance, and I'm using that number as sort of a benchmark as we talk about our stormwater improvement program, there's about a $376,000 interest savings on that over time. If we were downgraded 2 notches, which that's not out of the question, we're talking over $1.5 million. This is as of the market yesterday. The market yesterday is actually really positive in terms of where interest rates are at right now. It is not what I would consider a normal market because issuance is really low right now. So these numbers are definitely on the low side. We know as we go out and we are looking to fund the stormwater improvement program, we're not looking to do it in one tranche. We are probably going to do it over several years, and we should expect that interest rates are going to go up over time. So these numbers that we're talking about here would actually be larger, not less. So what's the near-term impact of going to an open amortization period? Because there's going to be a cost to this. So if you look at the table, this top line here is what the contribution is going to be required under the closed system. And you can see that it's going to go up over time, but you already knew to expect that from the chart that we talked about before. We know that our required contributions are going to continue to escalate. This next part of the table is putting the actuary worked on what our required contributions would be if we went to a 15-year amortization period and we transitioned it over 3 years. So we were again trying to mitigate the impact to the taxpayer over time. That's what those numbers are. And down here, then you can see what the difference is. So the required contribution, if we go forward in 2020, requires $340,000 more than what our 2019 contribution amount is going to be. And then you can see those numbers over time. And in 2024, if you think back to the memo that was provided as part of this board meeting, that memo showed you a chart that looked out over time between now and 2030. And what you're going to see, and the reason why we focused on the years that we did, is up through 2030, the contribution is going up. After 2023, our required contribution in a 15-year rolling amortization period starts to come down. So what we were trying to do is manage this small ramp up that we were having over the next 3 years. So how did we think about doing that? We talked about various revenue sources that we could tap into. And during those discussions, we were thinking about the amount of revenue that you can generate and the stability of that over time. And after going through that analysis, really, it became one where the feeling was we really do need to look to the tax levy as being a stable revenue source to fund this. But as a way to try to mitigate the increase that would happen over time, we know that we have had strong reserves built up over time. We know that our results as we look at 2018, that our reserves are actually better than what we even anticipated. So we looked at using a portion of those reserves over time to mitigate what the actual overall increase in the tax levy was going to be. So we have plotted out what could be a way to use reserves over time to bring down the natural increase that would need to happen in the tax levy.
Now, tonight, I guess I should have asked the question earlier, are we just sort of giving a nod to the staff? We're not like deciding that is the actual funding mechanism. Is our decision tonight just sort of a nod that, yes, this is the path we'd like to go down, as opposed to debating, should it be 300,000 or 200,000 or whatever?
Correct.
That's more of a budget discussion.
Yes, exactly. The business decision comes in the fall when we do the budget, but the staff would take this as direction that this would be how we would begin to prepare the budget to implement this. And then the board actually votes on it when we're ready to start appropriating money to do it.
Okay, yeah, because I know last budget, we sort of first brought up the topic of where the reserves are and what's the
Yes.
appropriate level, and I know the Finance Committee has had some conversations on that. So how we allocate that reserve to the extent we feel we have excess, that's not the discussion tonight. That's a discussion when we talk about the budget.
Correct.
Okay.
So
I just want to know if we need to focus on that, and I think what you're saying is don't focus on that tonight. This is, one proposal that the Finance Committee is putting forth.
Correct. So this is an item that is large enough and complex enough that, again, as we've said now a couple times, the Finance Committee has spent several years looking at this. So we're kind of pulling this out of the normal budget discussion that we really get started in about a month from now when I come and I talk to you about our mid-year reviews and such. This was an item that really required us to kind of pull it out on a piece on its own and start thinking about what the impact could be. So as we've had discussions with the Finance Committee and with the trustees, we are trying to get buy-in to this idea, and if this is something that we are comfortable with, then that's what we're going to use as we build the 2020 budget. And again, as we get those numbers finalized, and if this is something the board wants to do going forward, then the next logical things that are going to happen is that when the actuary goes to prepare next year's valuation, this will be the funding model that they'll be working with, a 15-year rolling amortization period. When we go to the market, this is what we'll be talking to the rating agencies about, that yes, we are in fact adopting this.
And this is, while the rating agencies don't dictate policy, this would be an issue for them if we decided not to improve our funding mechanism.
Correct. And I think the other point that you're making is, although they are focused on it in the way that they look at us, we know we're going to have an issue in the out years. So that escalation that we talked about back here, and that the Finance Committee spent a lot of time at looking at, that is an issue for us. So as a way to try to address that, to help make it more manageable in the future, is truly what this sort of change is going to accomplish for us.
I mean, it's sort of equivalent to, prepaying your mortgage to, in essence, have a lower required payment over time. You're putting money into the pot earlier so that it earns investment returns, and by
Correct.
increasing it a little bit today, you avoid
Yes.
the big bad increases in the future. Is that?
Because the converse is, if you don't tackle it at all, it's going to continue to grow by an interest rate amount.
Right, and if you change that chart to that chart's 2040, right?
Yes.
I can't see it. But if you change that to 2050, it just keeps going until you get to 2050.
Exactly. All it's going to do is it's going to keep it leveled out, but the escalation that we're going to have into 2050 is going to be even larger because that unfunded liability amount is going to have another 10 years to grow.
I mean, you could argue that not making some change here is sort of irresponsible for this board, given, you're basically passing it on to, literally future generations of people that live here,
Yes.
in 2030 and 2040, so.
And I think very good questions, and I don't want to, but, that's really what I think both Ms. Melinda and Mike Brayman challenged us with, and what we were hearing is we had to do something. We just couldn't go with the status quo. So I think rating agencies, from our understanding, is this at least is a plan, and that's where we reviewed a number of different plans. Obviously, it's not a guarantee. They're
Right.
not guaranteeing that if we do this, that our rating might not change, but at least it's a plan to address the escalating, basically the doubling of the cost of the pensions. We'd all like to use $6 million somewhere else or $7 million, but at least this does address it. I think your point on what we're deciding tonight, just a little bit, how we approach and how we handle the pensions and the rolling amortization, whether it was 20 years or 15, we ultimately are recommending 15, is the crux of the decision. To soften, what I'm going to say is we're going to have to go and rather than just passing that on 100% to the residents as an increase in the tax levy, that's when we had talked about the reserves. But the Finance Committee, and I don't want to speak for Trustee Plunkett or Trustee Pierce, but I think we were all in agreement. We did want to use some of the reserves for that, but not 100%. We know that we couldn't say we're going to use 100% of the reserves just for this pension issue because we have other things that would be used
Correct.
for. But is there some amount that we think is manageable? And to Mr. Frenzer's point, it's something that we should do in the budget process.
Right, it's also my understanding that we do have to get the tax levy up to a certain point to sort of cover it on an ongoing basis. You can use the reserves up front to sort of give you a little boost, but at the end of the day, the ongoing number has to be there. And given the uncertainty and the economic sensitivity of the other revenue sources, the property tax is the one that we can control.
Correct.
That's the one that shows up every year if we ask for it.
Correct.
All right, questions for Ms. Malloy? Trustee Pierce, or comments? You were in these deliberations?
Just a question. By acknowledging that our goal is really to have a 85 to 90% funded, as opposed to eventually trying to get to 100%, but by acknowledging that we're comfortable with that, does the state object to that? I know I'd be surprised.
So that's a great
but-
question, and there's two answers to that. So number one, the current state statute is to be 90% funded by 2040. The legislation that they're proposing out there is not only to move the end date back to 2050, but they're actually looking at reducing the funding amount to 80%. So that's one answer to it. And in the valuations that our actuary does, they always do a chart that shows if they use just the state formula. So remember, if we step back for a moment, we said the village requirement is to be 100% funded. That's one of the assumptions that we have that's different from the state, and there's a few others that I won't go into right now. So the actuary does their model for us. One of the pages that they'll show is if they run our numbers just on the state requirements, they look at that number and then they make sure that our contribution is at least equal to or greater than that, which it always is. So we're always making sure that we're at least making that minimum required contribution. The other part to this is the understanding that the 15-year rolling amortization truly has a goal of being 100% funded, but by the nature of it being an open system, you will never be 100% funded, which gets you into that 80 to 90%, and that's where it's considered a healthy funded pension system. If your goal is to be 100%, that's where you're supposed to be at. You're not supposed to say, I'm only going to be 90%, because if that's the case in a 15-year, you will be then less funded by definition.
Okay.
But arguably, there could be 25 years in the future, we're feeling pretty good at 85%. I suspect that there won't be a lot of other communities, they'll be talking to Springfield about some other change and the like, so.
No,
But
we're not-
theoretically, you could be at a point where like, oh, hey, you're supposed to be 100 now, and you're only 85.
Yeah, unlike a private sector ERISA employer that could go out of business, could cease operations, and then no future contributions would be made to a fund. Units of government don't typically, we're not going to pick the factory up and move it to another jurisdiction or
Right.
another country.
Yeah.
Questions for Ms. Malloy? Trustee Dodd?
These numbers that you have shown here, are those assuming, based on the actuarial assumptions, are those assuming an 80% funded balance or 90% or somewhere in between? I'm just curious in
You
terms
mean
of-
the recommendation that we have? That is taking the 15-year transition, the rolling, which has the goal of being 100% funded, but where we will end up is somewhere between 80 and 90%.
The current projection, the top line would have whatever our current method is, which is 100% funded by 2040, right?
Yes, you are correct.
Yes, no, I understood that. I was asking the recommendation.
yes.
The recommended, and trying to understand, when you're calculating that recommended, if you're calculating it based on assuming you're 80% funded or 90% funded, because,
100% funded.
But in 15 years instead of
Yes.
whatever, 20.
So again,
That's-
just because
yeah.
of the definition of being open, you will never hit your
You'll
100%,
never hit
but
that
that's what
because
you're
you're
working
changing that
towards.
every year.
Yes,
Yes,
exactly.
okay. And then just one more question, which was, do you have any sense of what other communities are doing with this? Is this something that we think, or are there other things we should be considering that other communities are looking into, or?
So when I started out the presentation, I said this is an issue that we are facing, but we're not unique. This is what all municipalities are facing right now. And others are considering a similar approach to what we're doing right now. So it might not be surprising, there is a small universe of actuaries that do this type of work. And because it is such a significant issue that is facing municipalities, the Society of Actuaries has come out and made a recommendation that a closed system, unless you're truly willing to do that, is not the best way to fund your pension systems. A open amortization is more fair and makes more sense. So it was really the actuary who was coming forth to us and helping us work through this issue. But directly to your point, we do have several communities around us right now that are looking at, and in serious ways this month, they're going to their boards with ideas as well, how they can transition themselves and get themselves to a 15 or an open amortization period as well. So we're not the only ones who are doing this. There are other communities around us who are doing this as well. And they're doing it for the same reasons that we are.
And is this open to closed system, this is new lingo to me. Is this more recently where the actuaries have said this is how we should be really approaching this problem?
So I'm not going to tell you that I know exactly what
Right.
the actuaries always talk about. What I can tell you is that this is an idea that within the past 2 to 3 years has become, I don't know if I want to call it a buzzword, but it is a buzzword in terms of entities trying to understand how are they going to tackle the issue that's before them. Because prior to that, at least in the state of Illinois, so Illinois is sort of unique in the way that it funds its pension systems and what it's put in place. the discussion was always what is going to be the end date for our closed system. There was never a discussion about doing an
Open or
open
closed,
system.
right.
And one of the challenges that you have to get over is if you go to an open period, are you going to be making a contribution that is greater than what the minimum required contribution is? And that's one that we at least know for the next decade is not one that we are going to have a problem with.
And there's really no way around it. There's no magical pixie dust going to be tossed on our pension funds other than putting money in, getting good returns.
And that's a great question, because one of the things that we looked at, we had enough of a model that we could work with that we looked at if we even made a large infusion of cash in 1 year, what could that really do? So we looked at taking $2 million and putting it into the pension funds to see what the next couple of years were going to look like. It didn't make a difference.
You need this sustained higher level
Because we have
for some
that
period of time.
$56 million unfunded liability number, so it really, in 1 year, isn't going to do enough.
If I could just follow up on Trustee Dodd's question, we believe that we are going to be the first municipality in the area to make this decision, and I think it's pretty exciting to be on the forefront of tackling a problem as substantial as this. In Illinois, we're so used to everyone kicking the can down the road, and we're being innovative and forward-thinking, and I think it's exciting to be on the front lines of that.
That's really I think the most salient point is that when we discussed this with Moody's at our ratings evaluation, what they call what we're doing now, what all the other municipalities doing is treading water. And treading water is actually just making the problem worse. And unless we stop treading water, there's really no set of circumstances under which we're going to hold on to the type of bond rating that we have, especially as we're looking forward to considerable new bond issues for our stormwater project.
And I think this does address, and some of the slides that are on here, you look at, when you see the contribution requirements nearly doubling, you know it's not realistic. I mean, we can't come up with $4 to $5 million, and it can't just be done on the text. This does level set and gives us a plan. So.
Soon to be trustees, this is the kind of exciting stuff we do here, you know?
And just, so we didn't, you didn't specifically address this, but we talk about the transition. If you could just briefly, because we did consider just jumping into the 15-year rolling amortization, and
Yep.
that was going to be a lot. So if maybe
Yes.
you could just explain what the transition means.
So back on this slide here, when we talked about some of the different things that the Finance Committee looked at, one of the things, not only was there this idea of, okay, what happens if we just do a large infusion of cash? What does that do? But even if we, in 1 year, go from this closed system to the open system, what was that delta going to look like? And it was significant enough that it was not one that was going to be readily handled in a tax levy increase or a use of reserves to be able to manage it. So the reason why we looked at the 3-year transition is, if I can have you, because I don't have it here on this presentation, but in the packets that you have, there is a chart. You have 2 charts in there. One is to show you the baseline, what it looks like over time in terms of required contributions and the funding levels. The other one looks at the proposal that you have in front of you, and it's the transition. And what happens is you see our required contribution is going to go up in the next 3 to 4 years, and then it's going to start coming down. So this transition phase that we were looking at is for those years where it was going to continue to ramp up. So by getting ourselves kind of past that hump that we were going to have, that's why we looked at doing it in a 3-year transition phase.
Let's see, as far as the 3-year transition, tell me if I'm correct in this. The reason you're starting it in 2020 is, first of all, to get that money into the system sooner, and second of all, keep the good bond rating because of some things that are coming up, like a new police station.
Yes.
And some other big things.
And the sooner we address it, the sooner that unfunded liability stops growing at the rate that it is.
Okay, thank you.
All right, any further questions for Ms. Malloy? And so again, what you're asking us is to sort of give a nod that this is how we'd like the budget prepared. This is how we'd like the actuaries to do their work going forward. Is that?
Yes.
And then just so I don't confuse folks, at the next meeting, you are going to see the valuations that were done, given the results of 2018. It's done on the closed system. That's not going to be done on the open, right?
Yes.
It will be then next year's valuation that you look at would have this 15-year rolling amortization.
Right, but the only action, the action to actually take is allocating the money in the budget process.
Yes.
Tonight, this is
Correct.
just direction for the staff, so does that make sense to everyone? Obviously, Finance Committee, Trustee Wolf? Yeah. Yes. Trustee Kurzman? Okay, all right, so I think you've got a consensus on the board
Great.
that we're going to tackle this problem in this way.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Okay, back to the Finance Committee, Trustee Sullivan.
Everything else was handled on consent.
Administration Committee, Trustee Dodd.
All items on consent?
Municipal Services, Trustee Wolf.
All items covered on consent?
Public Safety, Trustee Kurzman.
All items covered on consent.
Judiciary Committee, Trustee Plunkett.
All items covered on consent.
There are no reports from our special committees. Item 7 is new business. There's no additional new business to discuss. Item 8, matters referred to standing committees, no actions to take there, so we'll move on to item 9, which is adjournment. May I have a motion?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second?
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Are there any opposed? We stand adjourned.
Someone's.
It's too late.